In this interview, I'm joined by Métsal Wangmo, a lama in the non-monastic gTér lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. We learn about Métsal's explorations in meditation and shamanism that led her to commit to lifelong study with Ngakchang Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen. We discuss how Métsal's background in Steiner education influences her teaching style, and hear the story of the death of her first apprentice. Métsal recounts meeting and falling in love with her now teaching partner Jayür Dorje after many years of singleness, and the adjustments that relationship demanded. We also discuss portions of Métsal's paper on Vajra romance, including the importance of reconciling the inner male and female aspects. So, without further ado, Métsal Wangmo. Métsal Wangmo, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
You're very welcome, Steve. It's a pleasure.
So often when I interview people, the first thing I ask them is how they became interested in things like meditation, or in your case, Tibetan Buddhism and things of that nature. So how was it that you first became interested in this whole area?
It's always really difficult to know where something might have started. So obviously I wasn't brought up, well, I don't know if it's obvious actually, but I wasn't brought up in a Buddhist culture. Very ordinary, about as middle of the road as you can get in terms of upbringing, probably kind of middle of Britain or middle of England, near Birmingham, kind of lower middle class, very ordinary parents, a teacher and an engineer, and a pretty ordinary but delightful, I think, upbringing. In fact, I can't remember that much about it, and my mother once, when she and my sister were reminiscing about something wonderful that happened when we were younger, I said, "Oh, I don't really remember that." And she said, "Oh, I don't know why we bothered giving you a lovely childhood. You can't remember any of it." And I think actually that's probably going to be the problem with me going back. I don't remember that much. As I said to Mom at the time, I think if you'd given me a horrible childhood, I probably would remember it. So I think it was just lovely. But I do remember that Mom was a Quaker. My father wasn't, but Mom was brought up as a Quaker and lived in the chocolate Quaker world. She lived in Bourneville and Birmingham. And we were taken to Quaker meetings when we were younger. I think when I was maybe about 8, I think we said, my sister and I said, we don't really want to go anymore. And I think that was because of the God bit. I'd not particularly taken to that. But I do remember really enjoying the quiet parts, which I don't know if you know what happens in Quaker meetings. There's a lot of sitting in silence. And I did actually like those bits. So I remember that. And I also remember there was a time, this is one story that does stick out, or one memory that sticks out for me, when I went to London the first time, when I think I was about 11, and travelling on the tubes, on the metro, and hearing the announcement when the doors closed about mind the gap, and finding it hilarious. I can just remember thinking it was very funny, and that, you know, the gap was always the bit that was interesting. And so that was lovely later on in life when I started trying to teach myself meditation, and I realised actually, yeah, it's the gap is the bit that's intriguing, that you have to mind, in fact. But I didn't have a great spiritual awakening or anything. I was passionately enamoured of my best friend's elder brother when I was at school, and he was a student of Gurdjieff, or Gurdjieff's tradition. So I think when I was about 13, I got really into reading Gurdjieff. I'm pretty confident that it was just because I wanted to be able to show off to him, and that rather than a big interest, to be honest. But I can remember thinking all this, the things from Gurdjieff about the fact that most humans are in a sort of state of hypnotic sleep, and we need waking up. That really did kind of gel, not just with the fact that I was fancied Ian. That, and also the fact that there was there was a dance, there was sacred dance in the Gurdjieff practices. That I can remember being really intrigued with that. So I guess those were the first sort of times when I thought, actually, there's a lot more out there, and that made me, that felt quite, what's the word, almost kind of warming, because I'd always felt a little bit like, I'm sure most of us, I'd felt a bit like I didn't really fit in my family, although they were really lovely, and there's a huge amount of admiration there and respect for what I learned from them. I always felt like maybe I'd been adopted or something, I felt like I was a bit kind of, I just didn't feel the same. I didn't feel like I took the same things seriously or had the same world view. So that I think that had always been there, as long as I can remember, feeling like there's something more than what we're kind of being given all the time. But I don't think anything really happened until, in terms of getting particularly interested in Buddhism, it didn't really happen until maybe in my 20s, when I taught myself to meditate when I was quite a bit younger. And then I practiced all kinds of different things. I practiced some Sutric Buddhism for a while. I did quite a lot of shamanic practice with some different traditions, and everything was pointing me in a kind of, it felt like it was getting closer to something that felt right. I studied traditional Chinese acupuncture, 5-element acupuncture, for 4 years when my son was small. And that's when I was living on the boat, in fact, in Oxford. And that really, again, that kind of hit a few very definite little bells, or hit bells, rang a few bells, particularly about the elements. I think that's where I really started, with a sort of just a kind of deep love for looking at the elements and how they manifest, and what there is to be learned from looking at the elements. And I think the fact that I chose to study traditional 5-element acupuncture was because I just had this sense that Eastern thought generally, I'd studied philosophy at university too, but not particularly that much Eastern philosophy. But I'd always had this thought that, Eastern ideas just felt like I could resonate with them more. The whole Eastern approach to health and ill health made much more sense to me than any Western allopathic model. So I think that had always been there. So various things had happened. And then I heard I was actually working and doing some shamanic courses with Spirit Horse. I don't know if you know Shivam O'Brien and Erica Indra. They're people you might want to interview them, actually. Splendid people. But they were teaching at Spirit Horse in Wales, and they teach and they taught and they teach a whole range of approaches in terms of, I think they have a lot of sources in terms of Native American shamanism, but European shamanism, South American. But there were also students of Ngakchang Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen at that time. I didn't actually know that, and I hadn't heard of Ngakchang Rinpoche or Khandro Déchen, and I hadn't read any of their books. I hadn't heard their names. But when I did, from Erica and Shivam, I realised that actually everything that they were saying that I was really interested in and really made sense to me came from there. And that kind of culminated with a night on doing a shamanic practice, a night spent on top of a mountain in Wales on my own, practicing. And during that night, it just got very clear to me that I just want to go and find this Ngakchang Rinpoche. So I came down off the mountain. I haven't ever really wavered in that, actually, since that night. I went and I found them. It was actually just Rinpoche, because Khandro Déchen had just given birth at that time to Robert. This was 20 odd years Ngakchang Rinpoche was giving a weekend of public teaching in the West Midlands, somewhere obscure. So I signed myself on for this weekend of public teaching. And I can remember I asked the organisers of the weekend if I could have an interview with Rinpoche before the weekend started. And so I had a little chat with him on the Friday evening of the weekend, and where I just sort of announced myself and said, I want to study with you. And he said, well, you haven't met us, or he said, what have you read? And I said, nothing. And I was just kind of, I think I was quite mad, actually. And he must have thought I was mad. But they were kind enough to take me on as an apprentice, and that's where I've been ever since. That's unusual for me, because I think I've moved with what life was doing a lot over the years. But and I was 30 something when I mid-30s probably when I met Ngakchang Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen. But from that moment onwards, I haven't ever had any doubt at all that Vajrayana is the path I'm interested in, and that they are the teachers that I'm interested in.
That's fascinating. I'd like to loop back and pick up on a few of those points. What was the meditation that you taught yourself in your teenage years?
It was really, it turns out that actually it was really just silent sitting. I didn't follow any program. You'll know that back in the late 70s, 80s, there wasn't that much available. You had to get books and things. I read a little bit of Zen, and I can't actually remember now who by or what. And I really just got from that, though, this sense that you just need to sit and let go of thought. And that's basically what I did. That's basically what I taught myself.
Some people, when they describe a feeling of, how did you put it, being a bit different from your parents or your family, having a different sort of set of values. I'm curious as to what that difference was. But also, sometimes when people say that and they look back, they speculate perhaps that they had some sort of reincarnation, past life that still had a strong influence or something of this nature. And I know that reincarnation is something that's central to the gTér lineage in terms of its founders, Ngakchang Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen. So I'm curious if you've interpreted that difference in that way.
No, not really. I'm open to all kinds of things, but I'm as most people who know me, I like to be incredibly pragmatic, and I have got a bit of a horror actually from, it's something I particularly dislike in the kind of world of spiritual teaching, is when people make things magical, when I think the world is quite magical enough and we don't really need to do that. So even if I thought that, and it's interesting that you say that it's important in the gTér, because it's important in terms of our lineage history that reincarnation exists, but it's very much not important in terms of teaching and practice. And in fact, it's very rarely mentioned, other than if you're trying to describe the lineage history. Because it really doesn't matter what somebody was, it's what they're doing in this lifetime, and if we get caught up in, there's some remarkable practitioners from previous lifetimes who've behaved appallingly in the current lifetime, and there's all kinds of people who are doing remarkable things, who are possibly the monastery dog last time or something. It just seems like a complete red herring to me to get wrapped up in. So I think that if somebody finds Vajrayana and a lineage, and there is just this strong feeling of having come home, and that everything resonates, even if you don't like everything about it, but there is this underlying kind of fundamental resonance, that the chance, and if you then stick with it, that's what Ngakchang Rinpoche has said to me before, because lots of people feel that, and people get excited and they think, oh yeah, this is it, but if you go, oh, this is it, and you're still going, oh, this is it in 40 years' time, the chances are that you've probably had some previous connection to it because it's such a strong pattern, strong. So I guess I think, the chances are that I have some connection before, but it's not something I ever spend any time thinking about, because that would just stop me doing what I need to do now rather than... I feel similarly about Bhutan, actually, which we might come on to talk about. I've always, I heard about Bhutan when I was young teenager, probably, for the first time, and I got really interested in it, and I read some books about it. So when we first got invited to go there, or we were going to go to talk at the Vajrayana conference, I was like, an excited idiot, and Jagir was like, oh, I don't know if I can be bothered to go to Bhutan, really. He didn't really know anything about it. I was like, I've always wanted to go to Bhutan. So I had a similar thing there. And again, you could get there and think, oh, this feels like coming home because I used to live here or something. Maybe it just feels like coming home because it makes sense. And it might not be anything to do with the past life.
That's very interesting. On the other hand, of course, you've had history in shamanism, which I think could be seen to be very pragmatic, but could also be taken in a rather magical direction. So I'm curious as to your background in shamanism, what your involvement was there, and how that kind of plays into this magic versus pragmatism point.
Well, the first thing to say is I haven't got a lot to say about it because I didn't have a lot of experience in it. And what I encountered really that I particularly enjoyed were the connections with nature, or with the natural world, and with the land, and with elements again, and also and animals, and this being aware of the fact that there is more to what's going on than maybe if we just read the tabloid newspapers we would think. That's really what I got from those practices, and it was only a short amount of time. And interestingly, that's partly what I first what Erica and Shivan were teaching that I first resonated with as well, was this connection with the elements. But actually they were talking about the elements as they are talked of in Vajrayana there, and that's what intrigued me. So yes, I don't have enough. As you can already tell, I can talk for, I could do Olympic talking. I could go on and on and on, but I really don't like talking about things that I'm not actually knowledgeable about or don't have any experience of. So I would feel I wouldn't want to talk about I just connected with some of these practices that where you were making connection, really.
By that, do you mean things like spirit animals and that sort of thing? Totem animals? Yeah,
but no, I didn't even particularly get into that. It was more just being in and being aware of the elements moving, much closer actually, as I found out, to the practices of Drala that we have in Vajrayana, where you're just being aware of the world that's so usually perceived as non-sentient being sentient. I think that's the practices that...
Can you say a bit more about that?
Or just that it is all sentient. This is the teaching on the 9 skies, which I'm sure... did Ngakchang Rinpoche and Déchen talk to you about that? No, maybe not. Yeah, but yeah, there's a teaching within Dzogchen, and certainly within the gTér, on the 9 skies, which is... and it's something that I can't give now. You need transmission from Ngakchang Rinpoche and Déchen. But it's a teaching about this that explains that all phenomena are sentient. That's a little nutshell.
So you met Ngakchang Rinpoche and Déchen, you said 20 odd years ago. What did that relationship look like when you went there to the retreat in the West Midlands? You had an interview and you were accepted as an apprentice. What was the course of study that you followed, and how does that relationship function?
Another good question. Well, the apprenticeship model that Ngakchang Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen set up, well, originally Ngakchang Rinpoche, I guess, before Khandro Déchen was teaching with him as well, is really, it looks a little bit untraditional because we're here now doing it like this, but yeah, I believe it's quite a traditional model in Vajrayana actually to have a main teacher. There may be many teachers, but to have a heart guru, a main teacher from whom you receive instruction for teaching. And that's still the model that Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen have set up. And we now have with the brevet lamas as well. So we now have other teachers like Jayür and I who also have apprentices. And it's a model where there's the basics of practice within the gTér, the fundamental practices within the gTér, everybody is taught, and that's what everybody starts with. But then practice might take you off in different directions depending on your interests. Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen are very good at reminding people and letting them know that you need to be interested in practice. There needs to be a bit of passion there. Otherwise, it's hard work, and some of it's boring and not comfortable, and all kinds of other things. So having something that ignites a bit of fire in terms of practice is going to be more useful for people. So that's why different people's practice can go off in different directions. And I think mine, for me, was with Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen was really just right from the beginning having this, as I said, this real sort of conviction that this was this style of practice was what I really wanted to promote, actually. So this was the practice style of the Gurkha, this non-monastic, non-renunciate style of practice, which just seemed so important, and still does, is the most important thing to me. So I think just realizing that there is this whole way of being a very serious Buddhist practitioner out there available, but people don't know about it. Very little is known about it. So and it seemed like Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen were the only people really promoting that in any way that you could come across. And so I think that's what, for me, that's what I picked up on very quickly when I started studying with them, was that, that's what I really wanted to promote. And that ended up with fairly, not that long after I'd been an apprentice, really, of having a conversation with another student of theirs in my kitchen. This is something I can remember. Where we were actually talking about the 14 root vows, which are the tantric root vows. So this is the sort of tantric equivalent of the monastic Vinaya, and it's particularly the root vows that the Gurkha take, these yogic practitioners within Vajrayana. And we were talking about the fact that there are these two root vows which are slightly contradictory. Well, the seventh one said we should never reveal tantric teachings to those who are not ready to receive them, the seventh root vow. And the 12th root vow says we should never refuse to teach those who seek instruction. And we were having this conversation about, that these two, and I was laughingly saying, it's quite easy to keep the seventh one about never revealing the tantric teachings, because nobody knows we're here and nobody's going to ask us about it. I said, actually, that means if I follow that logic, my own logic through there, then never refusing to teach those who seek instruction seems quite easy to keep at the moment, because no one's going to ask me, because nobody knows. And that was when we had this idea that, this student that I was talking to, he said to me, well, what would you do then if you wanted to make it more available? And I said, well, I'd open a Buddhist centre on a busy street, on the high street, on Gloucester Road, in fact, Buddha Boulevard in Bristol. And then people would see this yogic style of practice and not just the monastic style, which everybody has got a picture of in their heads with the Dalai Lama. And he said, well, go on then, do it. And he kind of challenged me, and he extremely kindly, I'm not going to say who he is because I don't want to out him without his agreement, but he very kindly said, well, I'll bankroll it. If you want to open a centre, I will help with that and with the finances of it, and for a few years. And that's what we did. So we opened this centre, which was Arrow Ling, which we opened on Gloucester Road in Bristol. And that was really entirely from having taken this love and passion for Gurkha Changlo practice from Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen, and thinking, how do I further that instruction which Rinpoche had from Dudjom Rinpoche back in the 1970s, where Dudjom Rinpoche asked him to establish the non-monastic practice, the Gurkha Changlo in the West. So this really feels, that to me is what apprenticeship is ultimately. It's where we're all continuing the same, continuing along the same vector, really, in terms of making this style of Buddhist practice more available in the world.
One of the features of that apprenticeship relationship that's often emphasized is the individual way in which the Lama works with the student or the apprentice. So I'm curious, what's the general curricula that you mentioned everybody gets, more or less, and what were the ways in which you worked specifically? Which directions did you go off in terms of your own personal practice at those later stages?
Good questions. Well, the basic curricula that we all focus on is, first and foremost, is silent sitting meditation. So the practice of the Four Naudors, starting with the practice of Shine. That is for everybody the main practice, because all the other practices are actually dependent on that. And then there's a body of, it's really approaching practice from there being practices of body, speech and mind, from the three levels of practice, which should be there in any body of teaching, really, I think, Buddhist teaching. So within the Arrow-Tear, we have the Four Naudors as the practice at the level of mind in terms of the silent sitting meditation. And then there's the practices of yogic song. So everybody learns some of the yogic songs, some of the melodies. So these are actually, ultimately, they have secondary effects, some of the songs, some of the sung mantras, but their primary purpose is one of finding the presence of awareness in the dimension of sound. So they're Dzogchen practices. So there's song, and then there's the physical practices at the level of body. So everybody learns some of the physical practices to begin with as well, usually starting with Kunye. And alongside that, as soon as people feel comfortable enough to do so, which it's a very, how long's a piece of string, this, for some people it's, I want it now, after a week, and other people it might be 3 years. whilst they're learning the songs and developing their Shine practice. But then they'll be taking on some Yidam practice as well. And everyone starts with either Pamasambhava practice if they're women, or Yeshit Sogyal practice if they're men, and developing the practice in terms of accumulating mantra recitations and also sung mantra. So everyone starts with a Yidam practice too. So those are really the areas that somebody new to apprenticeship is going to be offered teachings in to begin with. So the sitting practice, Yidam practice, introduction to Yidam practice, and then a peaceful Yidam practice, and then yogic song and some of the physical practices. So then in terms of what people might do, in terms of people might get very interested in the physical practices and want to learn some of the other systems, because as you know, there's also we have the physical systems in the Lingesar Tema, which is nested within the Aroteer too, as well as the other physical practices within the Aroteer. Or somebody might get interested in Yidam practice in particular and want to start developing that, and perhaps we would practice an accumulation, so many hundreds of thousands of recitations of a mantra, including some in solitary retreat, before we'd move on to taking on another Yidam practice within the Aroteer. And we would start with peaceful practice and then move to joyous practice. Would be some time before you would, some years before you would get to wrathful practice. I should have said also that we encourage people from the beginning, as soon as they feel happy enough to do so, to involve themselves in some solitary retreat practice. And again, that might start very simply with short periods of solitary retreat, one day or something, and then build up. Because our solitary retreat schedules are very intense. So we do a lot of intense practice in a short amount of time. So people build up to that as well. But that's another aspect of being an apprentice. But in terms of what people might then want to specialise in, there are so many different aspects to the Tema and to the lineage and the teachings available within it. It's a huge, although Rinpoche keeps telling me it's a very small Tema, it's a huge body of teaching. So not that I want to say I don't believe in, but it really is a huge body of teaching. It has so many different practices. And I'm sure you know that we have the craft practices. There's the dance, the cham. So there's dance practice, craft practices. There are the physical practices. And then there's getting involved with anything where, I think for me, one of the first things I did was get involved in wanting to teach a bit. And I went through an interesting thing where I think I'd not been an apprentice that long, where I thought actually I'd quite like to teach. And I was a teacher anyhow. I was a Steiner school teacher. And I thought, this is something I can do. I can do teaching a bit. So, this is something I could maybe do with, I so want other people to know about these practices. Maybe I could get involved in teaching them a bit. So this was before I took ordination. So before I was ordained, I'd set up a sitting group and yogic song practice group in Bristol. And I guess then, a few years down the line from that, there was opening Arrow Ling and starting to teach there. So teaching was always one aspect, and that's one huge area in which Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen I work with them, because they have this teacher training program in effect for the brevet lamas, and they did, after some years, they did suggest that I actually started teaching and took apprentices myself. So that was a big step to go from teaching to actually teaching with personal students. And that was a very important, change for me in terms of, that's when I kind of thought, oh, oh shit, actually, is I think what I thought first of all. It's like, that's it now. You're basically entirely public property for the rest of time if you take that on.
What do you mean by that statement, you're public property?
Well, it's like being, I'm sure Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen used this term about being vicars of Vajrayana with you. Did they? They said that, yes. And that really does kind of resonate for me in terms of, not that I actually know what being a vicar's like, I suppose, but my idea of being a kind of village vicar and being always available. And I think once you've got apprentices, that is the case. You're always available. To some degree, that's the case as soon as you take ordination in the Gurkha Day, because you're basically saying that you will keep these root vows of never refusing to teach those who seek instruction, being one of them. So you're always going to be there and be available for to teach anybody who wants to know anything about practice, and in particular if you have your own students who are. And also it's just, that's now kind of, that's what I'm doing in the world. I've done lots of things. I've been mental health nursing, I've been a Steiner school teacher, an acupuncturist. I ran a school a centre for really troubled young people for kids company for some years. I've done lots of different things in my life, but this is kind of it now.
You're a bit of Steiner school teacher and also participated in this teacher training program with Ngakchang, Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen. I'm curious if your experience as a Steiner school teacher, which is a rather different approach to conventional education, as in this country, in the UK anyway, how that affects the way you teach, and also what have you learned about teaching from your exposure to Ngakchang Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen?
Well, I guess what I've learnt from them is that I will spend the rest of my life trying to emulate them to some degree, because their style of teaching is just remarkable. And I think it also is in terms of how they teach, which is that it's very student-led. We're all adults in this situation, or hopefully. So it's our responsibility to take, which is the case for all apprentices to some degree, it's our responsibility as an apprentice or as a student or as a student in teacher training, is to take the practice somewhere. So you ask for what you need in terms of teaching and support. And the main way that Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen teach is through example. That is by far their greatest teaching for me. Particularly, when I think about times where I was very close to them geographically and therefore able to be around a lot during the whole period when Robert was dying, and to have that truly remarkable, that gets a bit overused, that word, but it was a really remarkable experience to be with them through that period, and to be with Robert actually. But to see them so totally live the teachings, to walk the talk, was a real gift. They were, of course, unutterably sad, but they were not in the slightest bit bent out of shape by it at all. In terms, I never saw them, not even on the night when he died, when I was over there. Even then, they were still able to laugh as well as cry, and they were able to respond to apprentices that needed something from them. That never moved. And that was such a piece of teaching in itself. So I think that's what there's the ways that they work with us individually, but that's the main thing, I would say, is the example. And I also think that that's the case with Steiner teaching too. Good Steiner teaching is they talk about, you know, the authentic presence in the classroom of an authentic adult who leads by example of kindness and awareness, you know, and that's at the heart of Steiner teaching too, at its best. I was reminded by your question about the Steiner teaching, actually, because my first apprentice, and I say mine because this was before Jayür came along, so I was teaching for I think about 5 years or something before Jayür joined me. My first apprentice was also a Steiner teacher. I didn't know her through the Steiner world. She's someone who walked through the door of Arrow Ling one day when we'd just opened it. It turned out that in one of her previous lives, she'd been a Steiner teacher for many years in Wales. And we had a lot to talk about right from the get-go. And she was a really remarkable, wonderful woman. And she became my first apprentice. As soon as she heard that Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen had said that I could start to take students, she asked me about 30 seconds later if she could be my apprentice, which was wonderful. And she was a great teacher for me too. And unfortunately, within a year or so of her becoming an apprentice, she was quite ill, and she died a couple of years ago. She died of liver cancer in the end. But that was one of the things that made me really realise that this was a kind of vicar's kind of job, was that whole death process of that Zigzal went through, because we had a small Sangha by that time. I had a body of apprentices there as well, who all equally adored Zigzal. She was one of these people that universally loved, and she universally loved everybody. And she was a real mother to lots of people too, throughout her life, within the Buddhist world and outside of it. And she, when she was dying, the last 3 weeks she spent in hospital. I think it was 3 weeks, just over 3 weeks, and really quite ill, and most of the time unconscious or moving in and out of consciousness. But our Sangha set up this, and I really didn't want her to be left alone at all during that time. But my mother was also very ill in hospital in Gloucester. So my mum was up in Gloucester in hospital, and Zigzal was in Bristol in hospital. So there was just no way I could be in both places. So what I was doing was spending the day with my mother in hospital and then going down and spending the night, overnights with Zigzal. And all the rest of the time, the Sangha were there with her. So they put together this rota so that she was never left alone. And there were people there with her singing Yeshik Sogyo mantra throughout the whole 3.5 weeks, 24 hours a day. And that was, that was an incredible thing to witness, that care for somebody. And it really brought the Sangha together very much at the time as well. And then when she died, it was on Boxing Day in the morning, and I wasn't actually there at the point that she died. I got a call from one of our other apprentices, Paul, and he said I think she's just gone. And so I drove straight down there, and then I realised I don't know what to do now. I don't want her body to be moved and to be shoved off into the hospital morgue, particularly because Zigzal spent a lot of time in India in her youth and loved the warmth. She was a bit like a cat or something. You'd usually find her sat in a window on a sill with a bit of sunshine coming through it. And I just thought, God, she's going to hate it, being put down in this. And I also wanted to engage in practice with the around the body. So I didn't want them to take her away. But because it was Boxing Day, all the hospital administration was closed, and so they couldn't get anyone to sign her out. And also there were no, I didn't want to bring in a funeral firm. And we had this wonderful moment where the doctor who was responsible for signing her death certificate came into the room and to do the official signing, and started crying and said that she had just been so moved watching all of us over the 3 weeks, and she'd never seen anything like it. And she said, you know, is there anything I can do for you now? And I said, yeah, you can let me take her now. I said, I can't get anyone to release the body because the office is closed because it's Boxing Day. And she said, well, I'm only allowed to release it to a funeral firm. You know, you have to be a funeral collector to come and take her. And I said, how about if I become one of those now? And she said, yes, that's fine. And she signed all the paperwork so that we could take Sigsal's body out. And they closed the corridors down and let us pull up outside. It was like a heist or something. We pulled up outside with a big Volvo outside the back door of the hospital, and took Sigsal's body into the back of the car and drove off home with her. All completely illegal, I think. And then I took her home and brought her back to our house in where Jayür was waiting, and he'd got the shrine room all ready because we had a shrine room in the garage built in our house in Gloucestershire. And we brought her back there, and we kept her there for the 6 days until the funeral, which we did all ourselves as well, and buried her. And the whole Sangha were involved. You know, we all painted the coffin. People were there practicing. And that really felt like this is the job that people do when they're taking care of people's spiritual life within a community. It felt like such a community at that time when she was dying. And the other thing that I thought of in terms of being reminded of this Vicar of Vajrayana job was when Jayür and I went out to the east of Bhutan for the first time, out to the far east, and we went to stay in this village on the mountainside with our very good friend Sonam's sister and her family. And we arrived in the evening, and her brother, who is also a Nakpa, is a yogi practitioner. Her husband, Chucky's husband, he wasn't there. The children were there and the mother was there, and he was out, and apparently he was out. They told us he was out. He was doing a ceremony for someone who needed a house blessing nearby. And so we went over and joined him for that, which is a whole tale in itself. But on the way back from that, later that evening, he kind of disappeared. And when we got home, we said, oh, what happened to Sewang? Is he not coming back with us? And he'd got a call from somebody else in the village, many miles away, which he had to walk to across the hills in the dark. Someone was very ill, and they thought possibly dying during the night. So he'd gone over there to practice. And the next morning when we got up really early, Sewang had gone already. And that was because he'd got a call to go and see a sick child. And I realised, God, it's exactly the same as what we do, except, you know, he's going out to sick children and having to walk through the night to get there. We mainly answer the phone, or, you know, but we're equally available for apprentices in terms of being there to support what's going on in their lives. Not that we're not therapists and we don't give advice on that, but we're there in that role of being the person who did the funeral. I've done a few funerals and weddings, which of course are much more glorious to do. And that's a lovely aspect of being a teacher, is getting to perform weddings, especially within our lineage. That feels like a fantastic thing to do.
Well, in your lineage, being as it is non-monastic, things like relationships are emphasized, including teaching couples. Later, I'd like to ask you a bit about one of your papers that you submitted to the International Vajrayana Conference in Bhutan in 2019, all about the history and practice of Vajra romance. But leading up to that then, and in that context, how did you meet your teaching partner, Jayür Dorje, and how did that relationship form?
I'm laughing a lot because there's quite a few. It'll be interesting to see, if you ask him this question, Steve, it'll be interesting to see what he says.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you both, so it will be interesting.
Well, it was all a bit of a shock, really, for me. I think I'd got, in fact, I pretty much spent most of my life being single. Although I had lots of fun when I was younger, don't get me wrong. But I wasn't in a relationship with anyone until I was in a relationship with my son's father. And that was when I was about, I think Will was born when I was 28 or 29. So, it's quite old, really, to have been single. And then after that relationship ended, when Will was about 6 or 7 years old. So that was for maybe 6 years. And even then, during that 6 years, although we were together and very much together and very much in love, we didn't live together all the time, because I lived on the boat with Will. And then after that, I didn't have another relationship. And I think I had settled into the idea of not doing, really. And although the teachings on romance, the Khandro Pawanida Melongu teachings within the gTér are so pivotal and important, they don't exclude people who are not in relationship. Although they are particularly about relationship, they are also about one's relationship with reality and one's relationship with the world, being in love with that, actually. I kind of, I wasn't really thinking. I think I'd spent a lot of time thinking about it, and then I'd given up thinking about relationships.
Was there a reason why you'd come to that decision?
I think just being busy, really. I can remember actually saying to somebody asking me, a friend asking me about it at one point, and saying, where the fuck would I fit it in? They would have to be doing what I'm doing. They'd have to be a practitioner as well, because otherwise when would I see them? I'm either at work or I'm teaching or I'm talking. It just wouldn't fit. I'm on retreat or I'm in retreat. They would have to be a practitioner, really. So I think that's where I'd got to, is they'd have to be a practitioner, and there weren't very many of those around, to be honest. Not very many single or within a kind of sensible age group. There is actually quite a big age difference between Jayür and I, but that there would be limits to how far you could probably go with that. I wouldn't have wanted a relationship with a very young man. That would be odd. So I think I had just thought, there just isn't time. I had met Jayür. I met him 20 years ago. Yeah, 20 years ago. I met him for the first time on a retreat in Holland, which was a big sort of international Sangha retreat that Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen had, where there were about 40 or 50 people from America and Europe and from Britain. And I'd not long been an apprentice, but Jayür was there. But I didn't really talk to him, and there was a large number of people, and he seemed, he was sort of younger than me, I think, and I didn't really talk to him. But I do remember him because one instance in particular, one evening, there was, I was sat at the same table as him for dinner. There were various dinner tables, and Ngakchang Rinpoche was on that table as well. And various people had been talking away, and then we'd had the main course, and then they brought out for the place we were in was a sort of youth hostel type place, an old castle, I think, in Holland. And they served the food. We weren't doing our own food in the evenings. And they brought out this big platter, like a big oval platter of ice cream for dessert. And I think they probably brought 2 big ones out and put them on our table. And there was way too much for everybody. And I don't think anybody even touched the second one. And then Rinpoche just made a comment about it not being good, food, not being eaten, and being wasted. And it was a very sort of throwaway little comment. And then he carried on talking. He didn't really say anything. And Jayür didn't respond to the comment. He didn't say anything, but I noticed after a few minutes that he was just eating the ice cream. And he ate the whole lot. He ate this whole massive amount of ice cream and never said anything, but he just ate it and carried on very quietly. And I can remember that very vividly and thinking, wow, that's, wow, how is he not sick? I think was the first thing I was thinking. But then I was also thinking, wow, that, you know, that's an impressive bit of just sort of quiet getting on with listening to what the teacher says and acting on it without making a big fuss. So I think he did impress me then. And then I'd see him occasionally over the years on other retreats. And one I do remember, probably not so many years before we got together, maybe a year before, he came to a retreat, an apprentice retreat that Ngakchang and Khandro Déchen were holding in Wales, and I was organising it. And I was also organising the food in the kitchen, and I had people on a rota to come and help out in the kitchen for the cooking. I remember him being in there, and he was chopping onions. I remember that. And he was just behaving oddly. He kept saying quite weird things, and at one point I said, "What are you doing? Why are you talking like that?" And he just looked at me and he said, "Métsal, I'm flirting with you." And I just went, "Well, don't," and carried on doing the cooking. And that was, I can remember doing that, which is most amusing now, given what's happened since.
What kind of weird things was he doing?
I can't remember. I honestly, I don't know anymore. I can't really remember. It had something to do with onions. I don't think it was like the ice cream. I don't think he was eating the onions, but he was doing something. Yeah, that's a very good question. I might have to try and remember. Maybe he'll remember. And then I'll let him tell you maybe a bit about what happened to him in New York when he went to see Ngakchang Rinpoche. But then we started communicating. Jayür got in touch with me about a film, a project and a film that, in particular, that he wanted to get made, Hidden Yoginis, which is a big passion of Jayür's, is to get some film recording of, or to make an actual film for people to see of, particularly of Joma Sampel, Déchen Rinpoche, Khandro Dorje's wife. So Jayür is very close to Khandro Dorje and Joma Sampel, so he was passionate about getting this film off the ground, and he emailed me about that because he knew that I knew a young filmmaker in Bristol who'd shown some interest in helping us with some Buddhist films. So he got in touch, and then we started. It was largely a WhatsApp flirtation that went on for some months, actually. And then he came over. He came over for the first time to stay the weekend that Zigsal was getting ordained. Ngakchang Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen thought it was a good idea that she got ordained before she died, so he came over then. So he was with us for the last 6 months of Zigsal's life as well. So that's when he was first here. So it was quite it was an interesting entry into joining me with teaching, coming into the Sangha at that point, actually.
How did you go from not being interested in him, rebuffing his onion-oriented advances in the kitchen, to eventually entering a relationship with him, number one? And number two, what was it like to transition from being, I should imagine, quite self-sufficient, quite settled in the single life and assuming that's how it would go on, so not really actively looking? How was that to transition from that into being in a partnership and living with somebody and being around somebody all the time, and that all that brings?
Well, the first part of that, I think, was he's funny. He really makes me laugh a lot, and I think it was probably that. Of course, you know, when we're laughing is pretty close to all things marvelous, really. So I think, in the same way as when you're falling in love, you become more open. You also become more open when you're laughing, when you're finding things, when you're appreciating the humour in something. So I think I probably just, it was a question of realising actually that there was something there that I could be open to, and then appreciating it, which is not that difficult to do.
Was there anything difficult about that? The reason I ask is because I think going from mode to mode, being really a relationship person, either looking for one or being in one, can be very difficult then to be by yourself. But similarly, if you're used to being by yourself, opening up to the possibility of a relationship, I've seen some people find that very difficult. So was there any conflict or confusion in that process, or were you really quite open to going with that flow?
There was no confusion in terms of do I want this or not. That the conviction about being with Jayür is the only other conviction I've had like that was the conviction about wanting to study with Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen, in terms of it then never wavering. I mean, of course, that is actually something in terms of practice with our students I would advocate now. I mean, if you make a decision, then just stick with it and drop the angsting about it, because then you can get on and appreciate and enjoy it. So I would actually tell myself to do that anyhow, but that happened quite naturally with Jayür. It was like, once I'd gone, okay, let's do this thing, then there didn't seem to be any question about it. But no, it wasn't easy. I was really, really crap at it. He was much, much better than I was. I was so used to being on my own. The first few months, I think he probably had a horrible time, because I just didn't know how to do it, really. I'd just forget that I was in a relationship. I would, the two examples I can remember really clearly are having gone out shopping one morning, and I came back and he was there, and he's like, where have you been? And I said, well, I've just been out and done the shopping. And he said, did you have, I didn't have my phone with me or anything. And he said, you didn't tell me you were going out shopping. I was talking to you, just weren't there. And I was looking everywhere. I've been all around the house, been out in the garden. I didn't know where you were. And I said, well, I went shopping. He said, yeah, but you could have told me you'd gone shopping. And I said, why? Why would I do it? It was like it hadn't occurred to me that you would share information like that. And I would do things like that quite a lot, and also cook food or make food together, and then just go and sit at my computer with the food, because that's what I was used to doing, and carry on writing or something whilst I was eating. Very bad, of course. And he'd be like, we could eat dinner together. It's like, I was like, well, why? Because I've got to do this. And he's like, because that's what couples do, they have dinner together, and that's quite a nice thing to talk. And I also don't talk very much. I know that sounds odd given the fact that I've just bent your ear for 2 hours, but if I'm able to not talk, then I just don't talk. So he would spend hours with me not talking, and then he'd say, well, maybe we could talk a little bit now. So I was just not used to it. So it was fantastic practice for me, and really useful that he's taught me a huge amount about how to relate. He probably won't tell you that I was rubbish at it, though, because he's too kind. But I was rubbish.
Something in your paper, I think we won't have time to go into all of the details and all the points that I wanted to ask you about in your paper. Maybe we'll do it separately, the two of you together, about that. But one of the things that stood out in your paper was this idea of the inner Khandro and inner Pao qualities, the sort of inner contrasexual aspects in the system. And just to read from your paper here, you write, when a man loses contact with his inner Khandro quality, his outer quality becomes distorted. What should be spontaneously manifested compassion becomes neurotic assertiveness. This assertiveness ranges from dominance to violence, depending to what extent his inner Khandro has become occluded. When a woman loses contact with her inner power quality, her outer quality becomes distorted. What should be spontaneously manifested wisdom becomes decorativeness. The decorativeness ranges from inconsequentiality to superficial obsession with surface appearance, depending to what extent her inner power has become occluded. Women are attracted to the distorted male image because they seek to reconnect with power. Women have a natural relationship with power, but if they fail to realize it, they become drawn to seeking it externally. Women, however, are also attracted to men through recognizing the reflection of their inner power. Both occur simultaneously. Men are attracted to the distorted female image because they seek to reconnect with spatial sensitivity. Men have a natural relationship with spatial sensitivity, but if they fail to realize it, they become drawn to seeking it externally. Men, however, are also attracted to women through recognizing the reflection of their inner Khandro. Both happen to both simultaneously. Duality and non-duality flicker. I'm curious if you could give some examples of how loss of contact with one's inner contraceptual aspect would manifest.
Good question. I should say, first of all, that although that's our paper and the teachings all come from Ngakchang Rinpoche and Khandro Déchen, of course, this is directly from them, their words, many of them. That is the book, yes. So what does that look like? The other thing that it's really difficult to talk about, this is why when we teach on Khandro power and Nida Melongyu, it tends to be a weekend. It's quite difficult to get it across in a short amount of time without it sounding very like other things, but it isn't. So it isn't that whole kind of men are from Mars, women are from Venus thing. And it's not a yin and yang thing either. And the idea of the inner and outer qualities, people get very hung up on that being male and female. And we're not talking about men and women. We're talking about what's discussed as the male and female aspects of reality. But it's not about gender. In Vajrayana is incredibly fluid. There is no idea of what a man is or a woman. There is no limits. There is it's entirely beyond limit and beyond definition. So there isn't. So it's hard to talk about this, about women having inner male qualities without people thinking you're talking about male qualities means men, and men are actually like that, or women are actually like. So I just wanted to put that, at least an attempt at that caveat in before I say anything. But we have this, I think for me, one thing that was interesting growing up, just to bring it back to me again, one thing growing up though was that there was just me and my sister, and my father was an engineer, my mother was a teacher, and my father was really very good at bringing my sister and I both up to think that we could be anything. It was actually a shock to me when I discovered, I think I was actually at university before it hit me, that some women thought that their possibilities in life were limited by their gender. That literally just never occurred to me. I always thought I could do anything. So that sort of idea of there being nothing that's specific about being a woman was something that resonated with me very quickly with these teachings. But the fact is that we have these qualities. There are these inner and outer qualities with everyone. And we have this, if we are healthy in terms of on every kind of level, energetically and psychologically, then those inner and outer are entirely both available, and neither one is shouting louder than the other, and one is not occluded or diminished in any way. And that's what happens when we get these extremes, when the there's this huge imbalance between inner and outer. And that's when you do get these extremes of, you know, a man who's lost touch with any of his wisdom aspects of being. You know, it's also the same as talking about the emptiness and form of being. We're talking about the non-dual experience of being. So form and emptiness, compassion and wisdom, or even just kindness and awareness. But if a man has lost touch with his wisdom awareness quality, then his and a woman as well, this could be a woman, all of these can apply to women too. But then if you've lost touch with that an inner wisdom quality, then you've lost touch with that sensitivity, you know, what might move you about being touched by the pain of others or the suffering of others. Everything becomes a thing where you have to become bigger and bigger in terms of protecting yourself. And so you get these extremes where you've got the kind of Rambo, sort of King Kong macho is the far extreme of that. And similarly, if you have no connection with the compassion, inner compassion as a woman, then you may have lost touch with, you know, that's the ability to, I mean, compassion in Buddhism is always active compassion. It's the ability to act, to be effective, to be kind in the world, not just think kind, to actually be kind. And if we've lost connection with that, then we lose that power, that ability to do that, to be consummately effective, to have the confidence, the strength, the conviction to do that, as we can become ineffective, superficial often. So yeah, does that answer it a little bit without trying to get into?
It does, yeah. I think that gives a good idea. For those interested in the context of this question and the next one, which will probably be my last one, I will link to the paper in the show notes. So another thing, this comes to mind really in the context of what you shared about entering into relationship with Jayür and the adjustments that were required there. You also write, if we already have the connection with our inner power or inner Khandro, we no longer need to find anything outside ourselves. At this point, men and women begin to dance with each other. Something becomes apparent that dissipates unrequitable gender needs. Once gender neediness dissolves into its natural condition, a tremendous mutual appreciation arises. Appreciation arises because men and women catch glimpses of completeness in themselves. So I'm curious about unrequitable gender needs. I think that's a fantastic phrase. I'm curious what you mean by that. I'm also curious if your having settled into singledom was related to just, as you said, a sort of lifestyle situation, or if it was to do with a kind of not needing to find anything outside of yourself because you've integrated those inner aspects. It strikes me that entering into a relationship could disturb or create some quite upheaval in the, if you want, harmonious inner domestic situation of one's inner power and inner Khandro aspects. Now suddenly this other force or this other reference point is involved somehow, and that could upset that. If one's reconciled one's inner power and inner Khandro, why bother?
Yeah.
There's an awful lot of questions in there, but unrequitable gender needs is certainly a tremendous phrase.
Yeah, I can't remember where that might have come from, but I suspect it's a phrase from Rinpoche. I don't remember. But everything comes from him and Khandro Déchen, so it will be probably. Well, I guess the reason you're right that having settled into that happily into singledom is a very good base for starting a relationship. I think all of us know that if you need something from a relationship, then it's already putting that relationship on a shaky footing, a shaky ground. If we need another person to complete us in some way, then we are already compromising the possibility of having a wonderful relationship. It's kind of obvious why that is. There's this, the more I need the other person to fulfill something for me, the less likely they are going to be able to do that. And that's actually very much what this, how this mirroring works and doesn't work. But again, it's a bit lengthy to go into more of that. But yeah, it's that idea. So I guess, having got to a point where, I've always loved being physical and intimacy and relationships. To have reached a point where, okay, if there's no more of that, is okay, was probably a very healthy place to get to. Yeah. So I think, that was, and to have stopped wanting it, to have stopped looking everywhere for it, was a very healthy place to have got to. And, that's through practice. It wasn't giving up. It was actually feeling that it was okay, that wasn't there. But that doesn't mean that it's not a delightful thing if it comes along. I would also be quite happy to live a single life too. So I wouldn't want anyone to think that you have to be in a relationship to have a fulfilled life. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. Because that fulfillment is there, that possibility of that wholeness is there anyhow, because we are. It was really just like a bit like the sort of cherry on the cake, really, when Jayür came along. It's like it's an opportunity to, a delightful opportunity to practice some of these Khandro Power Nida Melongyu practices.
How long have you been together, the two of you?
5 years, a few days ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you. We realised it was April Fool's Day. We only just worked that out, though. We hadn't realised for years that that's when it actually was. But the other, the thing that's wonderful about somebody coming along like that, though, is that it does shake your practice. It shakes things in a way. Well, it gives you opportunities, to, if you're on your own, it's very easy to convince yourself that you're quite splendidly serene and rising above everything and can cope with everything. We all discover quite where our equanimity is when we're under pressure of some sort. That's so to have. I always remember a good friend of mine when I was much younger telling me that she'd always believed that she didn't have any kind of problem with premenstrual tension or premenstrual syndrome or something. She'd always thought she was a very lucky person, and all these other women suffered terribly until she got a live-in partner. And then she discovered that she had terrible premenstrual tension. And it's actually, you need the mirror, you need the thing to reflect it back at you sometimes to notice things. So Jayür is brilliant for that. I mean, one of the things he does for me is if ever I'm at all sharp with him or short or annoyed about something or what else might I do? Just not very talkative, a bit withdrawn or something, he'll ask me how my shine is going. Which is, like, that's an outrageous thing for anybody to say to somebody else other than a partner who you adore. And then, of course, when he says it to me, it just makes me laugh. And it reminds me that I need to get my arse back on the cushion if I'm feeling annoyed about something. It's nothing to do with him. It's me and where my practice is at. So, yeah, having Jayür there has been, it's challenging in many ways, brilliant ways. There is a whole aspect of the Khandro Power Nida Melongyu teachings which are about seeking that kind of challenge, which again is, we can't really go into that now, but that's also there in that teaching. Very useful.
Like a kind of chodpa kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Could you say a little bit more about that process of you attributed to practice of coming from someone who's very much enjoyed the physical intimacy, and then in some sort of a healthy way through practice came to a point of no longer searching for it constantly in that way. And then I wonder what it must have been like to open up to that dimension again. But what about that first half?
Well, I think I should say that probably the looking for that I was talking about probably had a much greater psychological component as well, you know, a sort of emotional neediness as well as the physical, because the physical side, the purely physical side, is entirely possible to enjoy as a solo pursuit. I mean, it's different in terms of it hasn't got that intimacy of another person, but in terms of it being, it can also be quite intimate. And certainly in terms of practice, you know, there are practices that you can engage in whilst enjoying yourself and appreciating yourself. So I think having reached that point, that then actually bodes for a much healthier physical, intimate life, a life of intimacy with a partner, because you're not needing anything anymore, perhaps, because you've already worked out how to do that yourself. So then you can entirely concentrate, which is what's there in the Khandro power teachings, on appreciating your partner and putting their pleasure before your own. And of course, what happens if both partners are putting the other person's pleasure before their own, you could end up with some horrible sort of British no, after you, no, after you on the bus kind of thing in the queue. But actually what happens is you get this sort of, you know, the possibility of this exponential appreciation. So I think, you know, that being able to be happy on your own in every way in terms of sexual practice and everything is the ground of being happy in a relationship.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I'd love to ask you maybe when the two of you together a bit more detail about that, because that is a really very fascinating area. I'm also going to be interviewing Jayür separately. The reason I'm asking about this relational aspect is it is emphasized in your lineage, and you've written several papers about it and presented at conferences about it, so it's something that you've spoken of quite a bit yourself. And when we looked to set up the interview, something you emphasized. So that's, for a bit of context for the listeners, one of the reasons why we've gone in that direction so much in this interview. Thank you very much for your time, and listeners can look for that Jayür interview.
I look forward to that. He's got lots of interesting things to talk about the Gurkha Day and what we've done in Bhutan and things as well. You know, he's a very knowledgeable, and well, I'm sure you'll enjoy him when you get to chat with him.
Fabulous. Métsal Wangmo, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Lovely to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.